So we have a substantial audience still with us, I think. So it's great that you've all stayed through to the end. I think we can take 45 minutes or so to wrap things up. So Caro, Shira, whenever you're ready. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Steve. I think if our presenters could come on, that would be wonderful for the final conversation. I insisted on some sort of conference normalcy by going to the cafe at the Clark and getting a coffee in the interim to try and boost myself for this final conversation. And there are so many thoughts, and these papers have really been incredible. And I want to say first and foremost that in many ways I feel also moved by just everyone showing up and being here and giving these papers and showing up in the way that you have with your presence and your thoughts and your generous intellectual contributions, because it's such a difficult time and this format can be so straining. So I am very grateful to everyone for showing up in the way that you have, and thank you. And thank you to our audience. And I do want to stress that for this final Q&A, I really encourage the audience to reach out and ask questions. We have many friends in the audience and also many people whose work has been cited throughout all of these papers. So please do reach out and contribute to the Q&A, because we would definitely love to hear from you. I was kind of thinking about how to pull all these incredibly disparate, not disparate, but incredible strands together. And I just have this constant, when I wrote a book on paper, everyone always kept saying, oh, well, it's the end of paper, right? And I still have this image in my head of these stacks of election ballots being piled into boxes to be filed into vaults, and just this way in which we are still, our democracy is hinging on the production or lack of ballots, these paper ballots, and so the ways in which paper very much is still with us, and that led me to think about how throughout all of these papers, and in so many ways there is, throughout media histories, there's an idea that, there's different ages of different media and papyrus and parchment, etc. And yet I think what is so fascinating about paper is that our own disciplines were really formed through paper and in an age of paper. And as historians, it's really the material of paper and the archives that we grapple with, and that it in turn has become so central to the formation of our own disciplines and thinking, and also the formation of artists' academies and drawing and sketching and all of these things. And so there's a way in which I wonder about, if we are going to reach an age in which paper really is obsolete, if it's also going to demand the formation of new disciplinary structures, right? And then new structures of conceiving of ourselves even. But moving beyond that kind of very broad, throwing something out there, I kind of want to return to a question that came up this morning that Josh really raised in terms of thinking about how can we begin to articulate the questions that we don't really know how to ask, and I think that there are ways in which all these papers pointed at different routes in which this could be taken, but I would love to hear from our panelists about, in terms of bringing together all these different disciplines, particularly history and art history, the questions that came up for our panelists and that perhaps had not been circulating before in terms of thinking about paper.
I can pick up on part of that, Caro, because, for whatever mysterious reason, I too have this image of ballot processing, like in Pennsylvania, on my mind. And it occurred to me, I think, partly when Esther was speaking about the stamp office as this place of surveillance which of course is exactly what's happening right now, with ever growing numbers of witnesses being sort of enlisted into the effort of supervising ballot processing. And also when Richard was discussing the kind of storing of all of this bureaucratic paperwork during the revolutionary period, one of the interesting things that I think gets danced around in certain of the talks, but actually, interestingly enough, doesn't end up becoming a kind of topic in its own right in our conference, has to do with the relationship between paper and secrecy. I mean, I think a lot of us seem to be really interested in paper as a form of publicity or of kind of announcement and declaration. In Esther's case, it was kind of the bearing forth of sort of the making, just having to, you put it so beautifully, but the way in which there's like an act of aggression that seems to be at stake here, with paper being kind of almost brutalized by having to publicize its abiding by a state policy, etc. And I just thought that might be another topic to kind of think about. That, I mean, it is, if Caro is sort of worrying about the end of paper, I mean, it is certainly the case that there is this long history of paper and conspiracy, which I think is also what accounts, maybe, for Esther, in your case, for that degree of supervision that's happening in the stamp office. But in any case, I think it's interesting that none of us actually addressed this topic, and that we all kind of instead embraced other aspects of paper. So I just wanted to, maybe that's actually a sign of like democratic optimism. I mean, who knows what that's about, but I just thought that was an observation that I had that seemed to be apropos of Caro's comments.
Yeah, and just picking up on that, thank you so much for that, Nina. This something, just going back to the last panel, this idea of the fantasy of paper as transparent and enabling and inflationary, but actually something that I think linked all those papers was paper as noise. I mean, I quoted from that account of the literal noise of the stamping presses. No one could see what was going on, but they could hear the kind of entrails. I mean, they actually used that term, the entrails of Somerset House at work, converting paper into gold, but the kind of noise in figurative senses as well, the way that paper sort of might paper over in that sense and distort.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point you make, Nina, because it's really recenters the way we might think about the operations of the public sphere and the relationship between paper, particularly printed paper, and the public sphere, beginning to think about secret spaces. So even public papers don't necessarily just move into secret spaces, but they also have their secret counterparts as well, the counterfoils and the other stuff that's behind there, that is the sort of shadow image of those public papers often. But also, of course, other kinds of papers and, more personal correspondences and that sort of thing. But I was really, I thought that was really interesting in terms of what you were saying, Nina, about deracination as well, and about how things becoming valuable to the extent that they moved. And I wonder if that might be part of the reason why we're not hostile, but in some ways we're blind to that secret aspect, and that we want to focus on the mobility of paper, but sometimes it just sits still and gathers microbial dust. And yeah.
Well, I was going to try just chime in here because the comments that are made so far, it may be the context in which we find ourselves in. I mean, I don't know if this is true or not, but sometimes I feel like there is kind of this. I mean, and I speak, as a historian who's kind of working in an age of revolutions consciousness, in which, sometimes there can sometimes seem as if there's this there's a sort of media unconsciousness of I don't know, history and teleology that says and sometimes I think this can be reflected in the ways that we write about the history of media more broadly, in which, you know, we seem to kind of be pushing toward a world in which, or we're kind of looking for the origins of a world in which, you know, more information, more publicity leads to more democracy. And in some ways, I think this is kind of like a deeply inherited assumption that at least is sort of embedded within historiographies that we engage in, and has certainly been present. I can, you know, speaking from the perspective of somebody who works on the American Revolution, I mean, this is certainly part of certainly the kind of the historiographical unconscious. But what in some ways has been brought home for me, at least when listening to all of these papers, is in some ways the way in which an actual attendance to the practices of paperwork and the discourses around them shows just the unpredictability in which paper, and if we were to abstract perhaps slightly a bit further, right, you know, knowledge and information, the unpredictability of the uses to which they are put toward, which I think in some sense should lead us, I mean, not necessarily this group, because I don't think this group is probably already aware of it, but more broadly as historians, whether we're art historians or just historians more generally, to really think about paper as something that you know, raises questions, I think, I mean, honestly, about some of the foundational narratives that, like the big grand narratives that we work with, in which, right, we just assume movements from, you know, undemocratic systems to democratic systems that are more you know, that we are at least some level, perhaps at the unconscious level, assume to be more transparent, or that we expect to be more transparent. And I mean, you know, but maybe not. Maybe partly what we learn from the attendance to material practice is that, you know, within ostensibly more democratic or democratizing political structures, part of paper's malleability and unpredictability is that it allows for all kinds of political practices to and aesthetic practices, right, to and again, just as kind of an aside, one of the things that has really, of course, I think been brought home by this conference is the necessity of thinking the political and the aesthetic as entirely conjoined. But that kind of an aside is that, you know, there is this unpredictability, and by thinking about paper, I think that we can do a lot to grapple with that. So that was just one thought on that point.
I have a comment. As I've been thinking about ecologies of paper, and you know, we're all talking about paper culture and the end of paper and paper work and the papered century and papered economies, where we haven't mentioned parchment and the role that parchment plays in all of this as well. And you know, in England anyway, in the early modern period, bureaucracies like the Exchequer and Chancery and the Court of Common Pleas had hugely cumbersome administrative processes which consumed vast amounts of parchment well into the 19th century. So, you know, as we're thinking about the end of paper now, but also fully aware of all of the ballots sitting in these warehouses, so too in the age of paper, there was a huge parchment presence, which might not have been as visible in the public sphere because a lot of it was, you know, administravia. But how, like, do we need an Ecologies of Parchment in the Early Modern World conference to follow on from this one? Just because we can't, I mean, there was really, you know, alongside an explosion of paper being used in all sorts of ways of statecraft, parchment was being used right alongside it. And so how do we, when we're talking about paper, are we also talking about parchment, or how much are we attending to the specific materiality of paper versus parchment?
I would just add a really kind of basic sort of factoid point to that, which is that yes, we are dealing with parchment too. I mean, the Stamp Office is also processing parchment documents. But for some reason, I'm pre-programmed to just be drawn to paper. So poor parchment kind of gets a raw deal.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, Heather. And actually, one thing I was going to mention to Nina is I'm fascinated by the finance collection at the Beinecke at Yale. You know, one thing that they have is they still have a bond from the 17th century that they take to Amsterdam to collect on. It's still worth something, basically, and which is fascinating. And it's thinking about the ways in which these speculative pieces of paper can still hold value in the way that, say, a print can still hold value. But I looked it up just to mention it to you, and I realized it's actually on parchment, not paper. So just to say the ways in which these things do constantly kind of go back and forth and in the early modern world. And I think to think about Heather's point, it also seems like often the parchment bureaucracy was present in a way to kind of shore up or act as an insurance agent for the paper bureaucracy. Somewhat it feels like in the way now that paper is kind of the insurance or the stopgap within our screen world, right? Like the paper trail exists in case the ephemerality of the screen trail kind of disintegrates into obsolete code. So I think that it is a really important point, the ways in which these different media coexist in order to create a support system of infrastructure that can move the archives and history forward.
Just to say that if anybody wants to pitch me a conference on ecologies of parchment, I'd be very receptive.
I would like to open it up to our audience as well, and so we have a question and a comment from Zerat. She writes, Shear's excellent discussion of Columbus's inventio and the availability yet finitude of land was in my mind while Esther, hi to Esther, talked about the Stamp Act. Esther, even the sheet you showed with the row of stamps spoke to me more in terms of Washington's reach for speculation in the Ohio Valley, what Indigenous scholars would call one origin of the 7 Years' War, as much as the story of taxation without representation that still informs the American Revolutionary mythology. Since you ended with ground, I wanted to ask if this other history might have room in your account. Thanks, and sorry for the wordiness.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Zirwa, and hello back. Yes, and of course one risks in kind of reifying those fragments, those proof sheets, which have been preserved precisely because of that kind of relic function that I mentioned, is sort of reinscribing that founding narrative and of the American Republic. I mean, one thing that I would really like to do to understand is the real reach and circulation of I mean, this would still be to tell the story from the Stamp Office, so to speak, but there is, you know, what is the reception of these things in the Caribbean, where there, you know, there are stamps made by Thomas Major, West Indies, so to speak. How does that work? How is that received, resisted, so on? And that's just a bigger story that I really have to explore. The question in terms of speculation and yes, sort of expansion, it's really important, and I think I just need to sort of go away and take that and think about that. But thank you. I don't know if you have the ability to kind of make your voice heard and chip in here, or just come back at that in the chat.
I think unfortunately our audience has to come back at it in the chat, but we'll stay tuned and see.
Yeah,
I also
thank
want to
you.
say that Nancy Turner is also giving a strong shout out for an Ecologies of Parchment conference. And so I think Lisa Pon has also raised an interesting question about the ways in which the metaphorics of paper will surely persist regardless of paper's material presence. And so Lisa asked, but the metaphorics of paper will surely persist long after I have given out my last handout in a classroom, which may already have been in February 2020. We are still speaking about this conference's papers, for example. How will these metaphors change and evolve, and what will we learn about paper itself as they do?
I mean, I can respond with something. I'm trying to think of a quip, you know, and I can't come up with anything actually quippy to say, but I do somehow want to relate this to Richard's idea of like the people who pass, you know, and I don't know, maybe someday we'll be trying to pass as like techno geeks or something, when in fact we'll all be sort of like repressed paper fetishizers. Which actually makes me think again about Ashish's talk, because one of the things that I was wondering about was how you interpret the moment when the Constitution does get fetishized as a document.
Absolutely, Nina. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that actually drew me to the, precisely to the project of thinking about the Constitution as paper and as a kind of paperwork was precisely, you know, again, not to, well, I mean, it's how can the politics of the moment not intrude, but you know, precisely because of the ways in which the political language around it is one of, you know, is one of reading, right? Is one of reading and one of is one of textual hermeneutics, and which has all of these kinds of very curious overlaps with, you know, the language of intellectual history, right? Does the Constitution have an original intent? Do bureaucratic documents have original intents, and how are those intents to be discerned? What would it mean to reduce, right, as I kind of have argued in the paper, right, bureaucratic intention or state intentions from the, you know, from the multiplicity of paperwork within, you know, an early modern state to the seeming singularity of a constitutional text within the age of revolutions that has a set of intentions that are the intentions of a sovereign, but not the singular sovereign of a, you know, of a king or queen, but the sovereign body of a bunch of people who've somehow come together and authorized this document, whether, you know, again, and whether it's the Constitutional Convention of the Americas or in France or in all of these other places in the age of revolutions when, you know, this seems to happen, and you know, it seems like that there's an entire moment of or problem perhaps here of kind of the you know, the language and the metaphorics of paper and politics, and the way that we kind of the way that we almost in this like very casual way of paper politics, but also I think the hermeneutics of texts, that these kind of three languages that often come together in ways that maybe certainly I think like when we think, or as at least as political historians, which I am definitely one, don't tend to attend to sort of like the just how drawn those vocabularies are from a set of material practices, which, you know, as historians of the early modern, we are very attuned, right, to the fact that reading in the early modern is an intensely material, felt practice that can't really be abstracted from the forms which people are reading in. And so I sort of thinking as somebody who kind of works between the early modern and the modern, I'm often struck by the way that those vocabularies around paper kind of carry forward into the modern period without, in some sense, quite the same amount of attention to the forms in which that reading or that interpretation might take place. And to my mind, the language and the vocabulary, both popularly and historiographically or in a scholarly mode around a document like the Constitution, is a really interesting example, because we talk about the Constitution as a document that can be read possibly with in a strict manner, or legislation that can be read in a strict manner based on the the intentions of its authors, and that can be interpreted Justice Scalia, right, quite famously used to say, right, according to the original intentions of its authors. And to my mind, this is a very interesting connection between the language of bureaucracy and textuality, and the language of the literary and the aesthetic that I think as people who are attuned to the early modern see as very much kind of overlapping, and certainly all of the papers I think at this conference have pointed to just how much overlapping the aesthetic and the political and the bureaucratic are in the early modern, but which certainly, it seems to me, also carry forward into the modern and into this very moment that we all find ourselves in.
If I was thinking a little bit to Lisa's question, the metaphorics, and how I like this question about how they will change and evolve now, and there have been mostly moments, as I imagine for many of you, of great frustration. I had one this morning where the technology is not doing the thing I want it to do, or just, I don't know, you're teaching students and they keep getting kind of bumped out, and the only way to imagine it materially is as if you were in a class and like every once in a while one student would just like go flying out the door would slam behind, and then the door would be locked, and you would be like, they'd be trying to open it on one side, you'd be trying to open the other side, and just this happens throughout class, right? And that's just class now. So to think about it materially is really kind of ridiculous, but then there's these other things that you come to realize. So in one of my grad classes, there was this moment of I had a real moment of empathy for the student, because you could see that they lit up, their face lit up. They had a really smart thing to say, and they saw it was shining and bright in there, and they went to say it, and it just did what it happens to so often of us. It just kind of like fell apart in the expression, and then they sort of apologized, they felt bad, and then we kind of moved on. But then a moment later, they collected the thought and typed it into the chat. And they didn't interrupt the conversation. They're just like, hey, look, I was thinking this, and this is actually what I meant to say. And it was really smart, and it moved the conversation along, and it didn't interrupt. And I thought, how could we do this in a classroom? Like, would you just go get up and write on the board? Or like, what would the affordance be that would allow us to do this? And it suddenly makes, I mean, there are these moments, they're mostly moments of frustration, like, why doesn't it do the thing I want it to do based on my material experience with media in the past? But there are these moments to think, that's what I liked about Lisa's question, is it kind of forced me to think about those moments of where I'm now aware that the material practices I've used don't do the other things that I'd like to be able to do in a classroom. That there's something that allows a kind of inclusion in that moment that is not, and the chat is certainly allowing a kind of inclusion I'm seeing in my classrooms that is not quite available in other spaces. So I don't know, I was thinking, trying to make a hard connection, but I was thinking, Jennifer, you said something yesterday about papers made by successive acts of disordering, I think something like that. And I loved that. And I think the sort of the disorderliness of now makes us keep noticing that all the little, what we took to be order, but we were missing. At least that seems to be the case for me in some moments right now.
Yeah, that's a great point, Josh. And I love this image of the student getting shot out of the classroom. But your point about the chat box actually brings me back to something that I've been sort of returning to occasionally throughout this conference, which is about how archives can, or programs, let's say, can anticipate or can create needs that we haven't anticipated yet. And Heather, this came up for me strongly in your talk when you were showing the image photographed under raking light, and you said that you had searched for it with the cataloging term raking light, and in general your talk was about how the kind of the thoughtful sort of seeding of catalog terms can maybe produce research opportunities that the catalogers themselves weren't anticipating, but just a kind of, yeah, seeding, I guess, is something that I've been thinking about.
Right. I mean, there's all these opportunities for the metadata to
exactly.
enhance the data. And that's just one way, but it's hard to implement consistently. So I'm sure there are images under raking light in the catalog that don't have that, but that's a good point.
There's a nice broad question from Colin Fanning asking, to pick up on Joshua's mentions of his students, a broad question for any of the panelists, if they happen to have thoughts on, is I'd be curious to hear how you integrate all this rich research into your own pedagogy. What does a focus on paper help bring to your work with students, museums, etc., in ways that other objects or materials might not? Or on the other hand, what are the challenges of communicating this kind of thoughtful attention to paper in venues other than scholarly publications and conferences?
Can I respond to the first part of that? Sorry, Colin, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do all of it. But for me, I mean, some of this comes back to a point that Shira made in her opening presentation for the conference about the notion of proximity as well, and our proximity to paper, our familiarity with paper, our blindness to paper sometimes as well, and that we almost don't see it as the substrate and we don't encounter it as a material object. And one thing I was thinking about through a lot of the papers that was sort of sometimes came in and out of focus is the question of orientation, which is certainly there in Heather's paper and talking about raking light and things like that, but verticality, horizontality, the codex versus the single sheet, all of these sorts of things have a bearing on our embodied relationship to paper, and how we it's the way in which we confront it, I guess, or it confronts us. And I suppose for me that proximity is something that I feel I can bring with my own research to the classroom in a way that's meaningful, and that paper can directly enter the classroom. It can't at the moment. Now I think there's an entirely different challenge, but often paper can get there where other things can't. It can come to meet them. But I suppose it depends what kind of paper you're working on.
I can also take that up first, with an anecdote that I think has really haunted me. When I was defending my dissertation prospectus, which was for a dissertation on letter writing and print culture and their relationship, I had my meeting, my committee was there, they asked me questions, everything was fine. I walked out of the room. And then I ran into one of my committee members on the street, and he said, by the way, I just meant to ask you, how's your paleography? And I was like, my what? And he was like, how good are you, how trained, how well developed are your skills in reading these documents that you're going to be working with? And it had not occurred to me until I actually got to my first archive and I was handed a stack of things to read, that I had never seen a document from the period that I worked on in all of my training as an art historian. This had just never been flashed on the screen for me. I didn't even know what paper looked like at this time, and yet somehow I had conceived of this project. So this story is not about the trauma of training myself, nor the leather jacket I had to buy myself to incentivize myself to learn how to read this material. But the story is about sort of what, and I think this is sort of at the heart of Colin's question, is like what, how does that experience then inform, like, what do we do differently? And so on the one hand, I have noticed, and I'm very curious about this, you know, I noticed in your paper, Caro, that your first slide was like of a Sebald book with Post-it notes like on your desk. And I was sort of like, why is she showing us this book on her desk that she's reading and her mess of, like, you know, getting to where she is? And your paper was anything but a mess. But I am sort of wondering about, you know, for me, I am curious about, when I show slides as an art historian, like, I'm asking for very different kinds of engagement. You know, I might show a portrait of somebody just to say, like, this is this person, but I'm not going to analyze this portrait whereas I'm showing this print and I want you to really think about how it's constructed. So there's this way in which this visual material is sort of passing through our delivery. And we're asking people, because we've made visual our argumentation, we're asking people to, like, to register how to read these things in very different ways, even in the course of a 15-minute talk. But what I wanted to say is that when I teach, whenever I introduce a new figure, a new artist that we're going to be talking about for some time, I like to tell my students what sorts of documents survive. So they have a sense of, like, with Rembrandt, the sort of corpus of archival material that we have versus Vermeer, right? What we know about this person just based on the literary remains surrounding them. And I think that this is of interest to me because I'm really invested and concerned in this question of legitimacy, of what it means to count as a person. And I think this is actually very like moving and difficult to talk about at this moment because of the anxieties that the election has brought about this question of legitimacy and what it means to count. You know, so when we were chit-chatting the other day before we actually started, Caro and I had a meeting with Steve, and Steve, I'm just going to talk about you now. Steve was telling us that, you know, that he had become a citizen and had voted for the first time in the US election. And Steve, I remember you saying, I live in California, it's not like my vote counts. And I was thinking, you know, I was thinking about what it means to feel counted and the ways, one of the things that this conference has done for me is to, I think, really disturb my sense of security that paper is a way, a means through which one can feel counted. I now feel, and I think this is a good thing, I feel less confident about that today than I did yesterday morning.
So just 2 comments. If I could have voted in Philadelphia, I would have done, obviously. Secondly, as a first-time US voter, I was struck how digital the process was. It was hardly a paper process at all, as far as I could see. And to that extent, radically different from the UK.
Hi, could I make a comment responding to the question? And congratulations, Steve, on voting. To the comment, the question in the chat, and I just want to apologize up front. I'm in my car and it's a little noisy around me. But I just wanted to say, in terms of not only presenting the material that I presented for our conference yesterday, but also in teaching, I think one of the things that I think that I might have lost sight of yesterday is introducing the material in such a way that you can actually, you know, see and process the details that are before you. And when I think about questions about, the archive and how archives, in a sense, and certain materials can, come in vogue due to trends in research, or if I think about the way that I teach and really think about the centrality of paper in the classroom, the answers that I would share are that even in classes that might be on contemporary topics like blaxploitation film and photography, or on slavery and visual culture, I always make it a point to not only take my students to archives. So if I'm at Cornell, to the rare book and manuscript library, to see the objects that we have there in the archives, especially those that they're able to touch, and to really introduce not only what it is that they see, but how they might understand how certain images come before us, especially when we're talking about prints that we teach in courses in art history. That it's sometimes so incredibly difficult to convey through slide presentations what an image actually looks like. Again, the orientation, the context, that it came from an album that was an album that was maybe a handwritten album versus, say, something that was printed for a tract, or something that was actually meant to be framed and displayed in a particular kind of way. So these are some of the things that I always try to take into account, so that students understand that while in, an art history lecture, they might see an image compared to another image, you might see the main image compared to a detailed image, that together those may have actually come from a different source altogether, and that one needs to understand what those sources are, that something might have been tipped in versus actually, again, being made for a certain type of display. Another thing that I wanted to say too about sort of the monetization and thinking about the circulation of these images and objects of paper, again, these tactile things in teaching. Another thing that I often do, I'm a collector of sorts when I can afford it. And next time, Shira, I'll think about a leather jacket versus maybe a document. But sometimes what I'll do, I like to do show and tell in my classroom, so that I will purchase, if I can, from auction, an object that's part of what I teach, so that I can actually take it into the classroom and pass it around, and have students have the opportunity to really see what the original source is, if that opportunity is not something that's possible within an archival space. And then one other thing I wanted to share is that a motivation for the last slide that I shared in my presentation, which was from a 2-page spread from an auction at Swan Galleries, was also to talk about how, at a certain point, as we know, certain parts of research becomes, either trendy or popular. It's in vogue for one reason or another. And I wanted to share that, those 3 different versions of the slave ship icon are versions that I think, were not necessarily intended for obviously for sale at an auction, but also they had different purposes. They came from different uses, whether one would be from, Thomas Clarkson's history. So it's after the slave trade is abolished in 1807 that this history comes out, immediately in 1808, and there's a version of this image that's available, or whether it's part of a book that's a primer for children, that that these have actually been taken out of those contexts, taken out of, torn out of, cut out of books and other sources, is something else that I'm not sure how much we really address this, but when I think about the circulation of many of these objects, that we have to think about, what is the circulation, in the early modern era, and then what is the circulation that we find ourselves in, when we think about how we're able to view and work with these images, to research them in archives, and how they're ultimately presented to us.
Could I just add to that something, Cheryl? You made me think of is the presentation, but also like trying to think right now about what access we can give, students to the classroom when we can't do it. So asking them to draw on their own collections, or ask, grandparents or something, see what they can drum up. But also the question of access is one that I think about it a lot, and I like what you do in terms of bringing it into the classroom. They're just, over the years, I've become aware of like just some weird moments around access, and really about sort of sense of welcoming or inclusion. And I've just become aware of like different places where different sorts of documents, different archives, when they come out, there has to be an armed guard present in the room. And a really good example of that is the Gettysburg draft of the Gettysburg Address at Cornell Library. So Ben Ortiz, the curator there, was telling me about this, and we just had a fascinating conversation around what does it mean to have to, like, what if you at what point does that become, if you have a gun there, why do you have it there, and at what point does a life become less important than a document, however incredible sort of you may perceive it to be? And I think that that's going directly towards the sort of the resonance of what we're seeing there. But I think one of the things that this conversation has made me think more about, because it's a project I'm trying to work on a little bit to understand better, is the bureaucracy behind it. Like, surely it's just, there's an insurance clause, and there's some paper somewhere that somebody signed that says there's got to be a gun if you show the Gettysburg Address. And those are perhaps good and relevant questions for us to be asking as well.
I agree wholeheartedly, and it is problematic, and I think I've gotten to see it maybe just I won't even say a handful of times, maybe 1 or 2 times since I've been at Cornell. It only just comes out every once in a while. But I guess another thing that I was thinking about with regards to the archives, and also your point, Josh, it's yes, when an armed guard has to come out, or when you really have to beg, borrow, and steal, get a grant to publish a book, because the cost of getting a decent scan of an image that you would like to use in your publication has gone up astronomically, because all of a sudden the archives that hold these materials realize, oh wow, actually they're actually valuable, and therefore we need to in some way up the price on what it is that one must pay in order to use something for a publication and so on. So I think some of these things are really, really, again, problematic when we think about archives. Again, thinking about, access, armed guards, who has control and access, who's included, who's not included, and even questions of ownership, to certain kinds of materials are really relevant to the question, and to thinking about the potency and relevancy of paper.
I've actually had better success exposing students to facsimiles of items than to the items themselves, because of the barriers to access, because they can't touch and manipulate the material that is so closely guarded. And so I just have this right here. This is a facsimile of a letter at the Folger that we've made thousands of copies of and given to thousands of people, and been sending it out to tons of classes since the pandemic, and walking them through, like, this is a letter. I was teaching an undergrad class last week where I asked the students, have any of you sent a letter before? And most of them had, but there wasn't a student who hadn't, and then realized, yes, he had sent a letter to Santa Claus when he was like 5 years old, and that was the only actual letter he had sent. And so having them see a letter packet from the early modern period, have to break the seal, read the inscription, open it up, look inside, see the format of it, look at the writing to see how it was stored after the fact, and fold it in that way. They get to really engage with it that way. And that creates, for me anyway, in teaching, so many more aha moments than if they were looking at this, flat, laid out with a sneeze guard over it. They're warned not to touch it, but this, they could actually do whatever they want. And they're surprisingly careful with it. They're like almost afraid to touch it. But yet once they do, it's empowering and engaging, and it gets them to want to write letters. So, and we've done that with, we created a facsimile of the first folio too, because we have 82 of them at the Folger, but they're restricted, so we can't keep pulling them out for undergrad classes. But if they can have one where they can flip through and see where Hamlet is and look for their favorite play, and touch the paper, which is a different kind of paper, but it's like a similar thickness, or think about the binding. And when they can touch it like that, it's just much more effective.
Heather, I think the Folger is about to get a barrage of emails asking for these facsimiles. You might be called upon to teach many sessions next semester.
I'd be happy to send them out.
I see Steve popping up. I know that we need to draw it to a close. I would like to open it up if anyone has any final comments or thoughts that they would like to share before we close out of this really extraordinary past couple of days. Anyone has anything?
I'll just say something really brief, which is that this conference has made me think I need to think more about actually the ecology angle. I mean, I'm now thinking about a kind of natural history of paper that is taking me away from the social, away from many of the issues we've discussed, more towards, I mean, the kind of interdisciplinarity that I've not experienced myself, which is like some of what I was exploring in my paper, which is like the weird conversations you have with ecologists or entomologists who, force you a little bit off, or, chemists like Jennifer's paper with those amazing, blotches of ink that are, if you add one chemical, the bubbles show up. And I mean, that's the kind of stuff I'm really interested in pursuing as well, is to sort of think of the field and the swamp and the bugs, and to think about paper in that sense too.
That's great. Well, thank you, John, and thank you for bringing it back to the ecology of paper. And thank you to all of our panelists and our audience for coming. We really appreciated it, and it was a lot of fun. And it feels the possibility and potency of intellectual engagement feels so much more important and vibrant right now, I have to say. So thank you to all of you. Shira, would you like to?
No, just I'm really, I feel really hopeful about the ways in which we're able to think together. So thank you, everyone. And it's great to see all of you. And next year in California.
Ecologies of parchment. We're looking for.
Okay.
I'll wear my leather jacket.
Yeah. So we'll probably do another conference on materiality within 3 or 4 years. So put it in your diaries for 2025 or something. I'd just like to say, on behalf of all of you as panelists and behalf of everybody still out there and the participants, that I think this has been just a tremendous success. I agree that it's extremely encouraging about the spirit of intellectual exchange and the effectiveness of intellectual exchange, despite the difficulties of the format. But most of all, I'd like to thank Shira and Caro for all the hard work that they did over the last 3 years in putting this together. And finally, to give a shout out to the team at the Huntington, particularly Ben Tuttle, who's been absolutely amazing all the way through this. I hope all of our paths cross before too long, and that we can have a real drink in a real hand, in a real bar. Fingers crossed. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.